The Legend of Zelda is one of my favorite game franchises of all time. From the groundbreaking 3D games that consistently impress with their quality, to the admittedly simpler, albeit quite enjoyable top-down games, and the jaw-dropping spectacles that are the open world games. Each subsection of Zelda has different impressive quality experiences to offer. Since November has been widely dubbed as Zelda month, I thought it would be nice to look back at Zelda's very first entry and give it a run through. I mean, I've only really ever messed around in Zelda 1, so actually going through the entire game and paying tribute to Zelda by reviewing it could be a fun way to honor the series' history. For this playthrough, I'll be going for 100% on a standard save file. Before you ask, no, I am not doing Master Quest. You'll see soon enough that this game is hard enough as is. I was also going to try to use outside help as little as possible, but I gave up on that quite quickly. I'll be entirely honest, Metroid 1 was such a struggle that it lowered my expectations for NES games going forward, so I'm not exactly expecting a masterpiece, but we'll have to see. Before we start the game, we're shown the iconic title screen, as well as a prologue if we wait a few seconds. In this prologue, we learn that Ganon, the Prince of Darkness, stole the Triforce of Power. Princess Zelda broke the Triforce and hid the pieces all over Hyrule. Then you learn your name is Link, which kinda surprises me that your character is given a name, especially since you name your file. It's kind of oddly revolutionary for your character to have a canon name, but still be a nameable character. We're then shown a list of items we'll find on our journey, giving the player a bit of intrigue as to where they'll find these items and how they'll use them. It's kinda neat. We're then instructed to go to the instruction manual if we want further information about these items, which, uh-oh, I don't have the manual. Let's just hope that isn't a problem. After pressing start, we're brought to the clunkiest file select screen I think I've ever seen. You press select to move the cursor to different files, and if you want to name your file, you have to select register your name. Then you get to name the file you want, but you have to manually scroll through the other two files with select again. Elimination mode, or the file delete mode, makes you do the same thing. It's really jarring. Then after you've named your file, you can select it and start your quest. We start off on a screen with 3 exits and a cave entrance. Of course, the player is most likely drawn to the cave entrance first, as it stands out on the green cliff side. Inside the cave, we meet an old man who delivers the famous "It's dangerous to go alone" line, and gives us our sword. He then flickers and vanishes, I think when Link holds up the sword and impales him or something and he dies. We then run off with our trusty sword to vanquish evil. This is where one of the game's biggest problems comes in. The controls are ass. You can only move in 4 directions, which is clunky by NES standards. That's right, other NES games let you move in 8 directions and it feels fine. This game would have greatly benefited from being able to, as it's more than possible. They actually didn't include 8-directional movement on the map in Zelda 2 either, which is super weird. It makes it hard to play Zelda 1 with a joystick, which obviously they didn't have back then, but it would have benefited the game to have 8 directions regardless of controller. There's also a weird issue where sometimes Link will take an extra few steps than intended when holding a direction. I played the game primarily with the D-pad, so I know it's not a joystick exclusive issue. This game has many combat encounters that require quick and precise movement, and the controls are inadequate for it. And before you say 8 directions would have been impossible, you can throw the boomerang at a diagonal angle, so what the hell is this game's excuse? All they would have had to do was make 2 extra sprites for facing diagonally up and down, and spend an extra bit of time coding it in. It would have made this game much more fluid and comfortable, and probably would have alleviated a few issues I'll bring up later. I decided to go left and explore. I bumped into these Octorok and engaged in combat. The combat in this game is surprisingly very good. The base combat with the sword feels a little The range isn't very long, so a lot of the time if you and the enemy are facing the same direction, the enemy will run into you before you hit it. It becomes a fairly consistent problem throughout. There's also an issue where sometimes enemies will bounce back when you hit them, and sometimes they won't. It feels a bit unpredictable. You also have very few invincibility frames after getting hit, so it's easy to take multiple hits from a single enemy if you're unlucky. When you have full health, your sword gets a projectile beam and it feels amazing. The beam deals just as much damage as a sword slash and covers a fair bit of distance, making it almost always the best option for combat. But if you're hit even once, you lose the beam and have to go back to using close quarters combat, so the gameplay changes to spacing yourself away from enemies and blocking incoming projectiles. Speaking of, the way the shield works is as long as you're facing towards a projectile, not using your sword or an item, and have the appropriate shield, you block it. The fundamental law of you can block incoming projectiles as long as you're facing them and not doing another action creates a really engaging gameplay loop of dealing with enemies. The enemies themselves are both varied and interesting, each having differences that set them apart. The levers unearth themselves to attack and then bury themselves back down again, meaning the best strategy to deal with them is to stun them and then take them out quickly. The Zols split into 2 gels after being killed, meaning the best way to deal with them is by waiting for them to get in a corner so you can take out the gels in a single slash. The Tektites are erratic and fast, meaning the best course of action is to use ranged moves that don't require you to get close. Each enemy requires different strategies to enact as many puzzles, but it gets even better. As you progress through the game, you find 3 main items for combat. The main 3 items for combat are the boomerang, boomerang, bombs, and the bow, and they can all be used in tandem with the sword. What's even better is that most enemies have a weakness to one of these items. The boomerang stuns enemies, leaving them vulnerable for an extra hit, but it kills keys and gels in one hit. The arrows go in a straight path and deal a bit of damage for 1 rupee each, but take out Pull's voice in one hit, soaring through them. The bombs deal AoE damage, making them helpful to use against Darknuts and are the only way to take down Dodongos. Because the combat has so much depth, it keeps every encounter engaging, especially since this game is tough and will punish you for dying. If this game had 8 directional movement, it would be the best combat of any top-down Zelda game, hands down. One last thing to mention is that occasionally enemies will drop these clocks that freeze every enemy on screen when they're picked up, which is obviously a super helpful power-up. I don't really associate Zelda with power-ups outside of Link's Awakening, but it's really interesting to see where that mechanic came from. After a bit of exploring, I finally found the first dungeon. I appreciate how the long bridge helps guide the player to the dungeon, since it stands out as something you'd want to cross. When we finally enter the dungeon, we're met with the iconic music and statues. I was pretty excited to explore this dungeon since it's so iconic, and honestly, it's a damn good dungeon. It has you engage in some light combat as it teaches you how to deal with different types of enemies. You're also taught that clearing rooms gives keys, and being thorough and grabbing extra keys is a great strategy. The layout is very straightforward, and it leads you to its map and compass in a very mindful way. In this room, after we defeat every enemy, we're stuck with a closed door and a single block. The block being the only thing in the room, along with killing all the enemies doing nothing, subtly indicates to the player that the blocks might be able to help unlock the door. And lo and behold, if you run into it, you push it, opening the door. It's a great learning moment, and knowing that pushing blocks can lead to rewards is important for future puzzles. Behind this door, we find an old man who gives us a hint about the Overworld, which I think is a really interesting reward for exploring the dungeon. These guys show up a lot too, and offer varying degrees of helpful information. Later on, we find a room that introduces spike traps, which I died to. Listen, I'm rusty! Upon respawning, oh my god. Not only is it at the beginning of the dungeon, but we also have full health. We don't have to grind, thank god! Plus, we immediately get our Beam Blast, helping us to have an advantage tactically against the enemies that respawned, along with making backtracking bearable. In this water room, we have what looks to be an indication for a bombable wall, but alas, it's just a standard wall. Every dungeon is littered with bombable walls, but we'll get to that later. Past these rooms, we find the bow, which for whatever reason I couldn't equip. We'll also get to that later. Only a short few moments later, I kill an enemy and it drops a weapon, the boomerang, and god, this is such a cool idea. It really makes Link seem like a scavenger, using any items he can find to help himself. Unlike the bow, we can actually immediately use the boomerang, which as I explained earlier has lots of utility in combat. I also notice on this screen it shows you a map of the dungeon, showing exclusively what rooms you've been in, and even entrances and exits out of the room. This really surprised me since it seemed so ahead of its time, but it proved really helpful throughout the game. Great decision on the devs' part. Once we finally reach the end, we fight the dungeon's boss, Aquamentus, and honestly, I don't really like this fight. Its fireballs are far too unpredictable and challenging to dodge with the game's controls, and it prevents you from getting up close and attacking it since they come out too fast to avoid. It also has a lot of health with a jank hitbox to boot. The boomerang also has zero effect on it, making it worthless for this fight. The worst part is that if you die, you have to go backtrack to refight the boss from the beginning of the dungeon, which is so tedious. The only way I managed to beat it was by spamming Sword Beam Blast on it, which was fun in its own way, but was kind of annoying to get set up, since enemies respawn after you die, meaning you're likely to accidentally take a stray hit on your way back and lose the beam. After beating Aquamentus, I grabbed a heart piece and got the first Triforce shard. Just 7 more to go. Now we're off to find the next dungeon. The only problem is I don't know where I'm supposed to go. Unlike future top-down Zeldas, you're not told what your next goal is. You're not even shown a place on your minimap, so cue 30 minutes of running around, dying to enemies, being reset at the starting screen, and running around more. I actually completed the Lost Woods puzzle and snuck past these Lionels to get to Dungeon 6 before I found Dungeon 2, which it's kinda cool that you can accidentally stumble into a late game dungeon, but it's really deflating that all your progress getting there is meaningless because you can't do anything in the dungeon, or even create a shortcut there. I feel this concept would fit an open world Zelda much better, but lucky us they never experimented with finding main dungeons out in the wild, so we won't be seeing this concept done right for a long time. Oh, and good news guys, remember when I said it starts you at full health when you die? Yeah, I was wrong. It starts you out at 3 hearts and you have to grind the rest. Luckily, most enemies near the beginning drop fairies pretty often, but it's still an annoying and quite tedious mechanic, and I was really disappointed to learn this game had it. During my exploration, I did find a hut with this guy who plays a game where you gamble rupees. You have to guess which rupees will give you more, but I'm playing on Nintendo Switch Online, which has a rewind feature. Let's just say I took advantage of my situation. Grinding rupees is hella tedious anyways, and things can get pricey in the game, so I don't want to hear it. I actually spent those rupees I won on arrows, which it's kind of stupid you have to buy them, but it's whatever. It finally let me equip the bow. I then go explore for literally almost an hour and a half before I say screw it and look up a guide. I find out the next dungeon is in a really unsubstantial place. It's just in the middle of nowhere, connected to an ordinary screen that's reused multiple times. There was no indication taking a specific path would lead to anything. It's just way too cryptic. Most of the cryptic stuff people talk about online is just for side content or Easter eggs, but I'll make sure to bring up the more substantial moments when they come up. Anyways, Dungeon 2 is pretty good. It has these snake things called ropes that dart at you in a straight line. They're pretty fun to take down, especially with the boomerang stunning them. This dungeon's pretty similar to the first. It's designed like a crescent and has a unique gimmick of rooms being lined up side by side. It's really interesting that they managed to add themes to dungeons, even if it's just different structures. This dungeon has a mini-boss, the Moldworms. They're actually decently fun to fight since there's 2 of them and they become faster and smaller the more you hit them. This dungeon's item is the magic boomerang. Its only difference to the regular boomerang is that it travels farther and is blue. It kinda looks like the dungeon, which is neat. Anyways, this dungeon's boss is Dodongo. The way to defeat him is by planting a bomb in front of him twice, making him the most expensive boss in the entire game since bombs are rare. Overall, I enjoyed the first dungeon more since it's more open, but this one was pretty good too, and was a noticeable step up in difficulty. Dungeon 3 has the exact same problem as Dungeon 2. It's in the middle of nowhere with no breadcrumb trail or guidance to find it. After pulling up a map, super fun I know, I eventually made my way to it. Dungeon 3 is pretty unnoteworthy for the most part. The Zols are decently fun to fight if you use boomerang strats, and the dungeon introduces Darknuts. Darknuts are pretty poorly designed enemies. The way you attack them is by hitting a side that's not shielded. This is really hard to do since they're constantly moving, and you're stationary when you attack. They deal an entire heart of damage, turn on a dime, and are invulnerable to everything except the sword and bombs. They're pretty unfun enemies to encounter, to say the least, especially since they seemingly chase you down after a bit, and there can be up to 8 on screen at once. The best strategy is to snipe them with the sword beam, though that's not always reliable. This dungeon's item is the raft, which can't be used in the dungeon, but has places it can be used in the overworld. When we finally get the dungeon map, we learn it's shaped like a whoa, blow that! Anyway, because of this dungeon's shape, it's a lot more open, but it honestly isn't very memorable. Most enemies are just Keese, Zols, and Darknuts, which isn't really an engaging enemy spread. Since the dungeon item can only be used outside of the dungeon, there isn't really much of a sense of progression. The boss fight is manhandling. The way he works is fuck! Oh, I just accidentally killed him in one hit. God damn it. Well, never mind then. I spent the next bit of time exploring the overworld. I managed to find a shop selling an upgraded shield that blocks more attacks, as well as a shop selling the blue ring. I also found the cave with the white sword, which deals slightly more damage than the normal sword. I then went and legitimately got all the rupees I needed for the blue ring, which increases my defense. I then set out for Dungeon 4. Dungeon 4 was actually quite easy to find since you need to use the raft, and it's clearly indicated where the raft can be used. It's a neat little bit of recontextualization since the raft dock stands out and you just be begging to see where it goes. When you finally arrive at Dungeon 4, you're met with a beautiful piss yellow color palette. This dungeon has bats. Lots and lots of bats. And these guys called Vires that turn into more bats when you kill them. Unfortunately, it also has the worst enemy in the entire game, the Likes. What they do is they slowly approach you and trap you, dealing about a heart of damage. They're vulnerable to pretty much everything. So you may be asking, why are they the worst if they're so seemingly weak? That's because if they catch you, they eat your shield. You're downgraded to your normal shield and have to go buy a new shield. This is a humongous inconvenience, since shields are very expensive and are sold in random caves, meaning if you want your shield back, you're gonna have to go grind rupees and look for a cave with a merchant. I cannot tell you how non-player friendly this idea is. This is an actively evil design, and likes gets so much worse later on. Anyways, past that room you find the step ladder, which is one of my favorite Zelda items ever. It only appears in Zelda 1 and VS The Legend of Zelda, a Satellaview game on the SNES that's basically just a remake of Zelda 1. The step ladder lets you step out on one tile of water that's connected to land, and oh my god, this is so useful. You can use it to cross one tile gaps of water, and it's basically this game's Rock's Feather. It's especially helpful in dark rooms where you can't see the water. Anyways, I like how they tease the map, making you slowly find out it's inaccessible from the angle you're on, but also showing another door, making it clear it's possible to get. This dungeon's mini-boss is Manhandla, who I actually struggled with this time since I didn't immediately kill it. It can be pretty lethal if not killed quickly since it shoots out bullets. For a game that's essentially a bullet hell, the controls are really not well designed. Anyways, I ran out of bombs, so I just tanked the bullets and killed it with arrows. The rest of the dungeon is pretty samey until you reach the dungeon boss. Gleeok, the dragon thing, is pretty much just Aquamentus from a different angle. It's even got the same hitbox and bullet spam issues. Its heads also detach as you deal more damage, but that rarely came into effect at all. Barely any of the enemies in this dungeon dropped hearts, so I actually had to leave to go get more, which was really fun and totally wasn't miserable. Then I just damage boosted through the boss's attacks. Overall, this dungeon was kind of forgettable except the step ladder. I then set off to legitimately see, get 130 rupees. Like-Like's damage is just purely financial. I then set out for Dungeon 6. I wanted to test if doing dungeons out of order was a good idea. It unfortunately had these enemies called Wizrobes, we will get to later, that absolutely destroyed me. After trying a little bit more to explore Dungeon 6, I eventually gave up. Even with all my upgrades, I couldn't get through a few rooms without dying, and I had no real way of dealing with the threats this dungeon had. I then explored a ton more until I found a waterfall. I accidentally stumbled inside of the waterfall, but you're given a hint to check it out by an old man. Inside, I paid an old lady to give me a hint, and she gave me a really neat riddle to find the 5th dungeon. After going up on a looping path 4 times, I reached Dungeon 5. Dungeon 5 is the dungeon I took the longest to complete up to this point. It starts off pretty ordinary until you get to this room with 3 Dodongos. I ignored them for now, but their significance will come up later. I continued on until I found a room with 3 Dark Nuts. Since it had been a bit since I dealt with them, I struggled with this fight, but quickly killed them and carried on. This dungeon had a lot of rooms that combined enemies. They were really interesting fights. I eventually reached the dungeon boss, but realized not only could I not kill it, I also had a large chunk of dungeon I skipped over. I eventually made my way back to this room with the Dodongos and took them out. That door led me to a room full of Gibtos that I quickly disposed of. One of them had a bomb, hinting that I might need to blow my way out, and sure enough, after killing them all, the door didn't open. Even checking every block led to no results. So I bombed a wall, and it led me to... Okay, what the actual hell? This room, with an unconventional layout, had 5 blue Dark Nuts. Oh god. Blue Dark Nuts are some of the toughest enemies in the entire game. They're exactly the same as regular Dark Nuts, except they have more health and deal 1 heart for every hit. This is one of the hardest and genuinely most unfair rooms in the entire game, but it only gets worse. Since you only respawn with 3 hearts, you have to grind up hearts to be able to tackle the challenge that is defeating the blue Dark Nuts. Unfortunately, there aren't any good spots for grinding in the dungeon, or even remotely outside of the dungeon, and every time you want to get back to the dungeon, you have to solve the stupid tedious puzzle you already solved. What's even better is to get back to the Dark Nut room, you have to defeat the Dodongos, who take 6 bombs each. You can only have 8 bombs max, and barely any enemies drop bombs, so you somehow have to go find those as well every time you want to refight the Dark Nuts. So after going through the hell that is the blue Dark Nut room, you do this block pushing puzzle that only becomes solvable after defeating the Dark Nuts. Inside this room to the left is, are you fucking serious? That's right, 6 blue Dark Nuts this time. You have to kill these guys to get the dungeon item. If you're low health and have no health refills like me, tough shit. This is beyond cruel. 1 room of this was more than enough. At this point, it's enemy spam. After grinding for hearts and leaving the dungeon to get health refills, I finally managed to redefeat the first room of blue Dark Nuts, which, yes, I use save states for because this is bullshit, and got back to the second room of the blue Dark Nuts, which I managed to defeat them all after refilling my health with a potion, and abusing save states. The punishment for death is grinding back hearts and rupees for potion. This is purely to save me time. Your reward for clearing out this hellhole is the Recorder, which is an item that can only be used in the overworld with one exception, that being this dungeon's boss. So we set back to go fight the boss. Wait, hold on, the Gibdo room had no way of going back through this door that closes. How are we supposed to... You're shitting me, right? In order to leave this room, we have to die, because there's no other way out. I checked a map. There's not even a hidden bombable wall. And yes, I double-checked the blocks. You have to die in order to leave. Great design. After retrekking our way back to the boss and using the Recorder, the boss becomes both vulnerable and a complete pushover. Dungeon 5 showed promise, but ended up having the most poor and unfair design yet. I did not like it. The Recorder can be used for warping around the overworld to dungeons you've beat. The way it works is that if you're facing north or east, you go to the next dungeon in sequential order, whereas if you're facing south or west, you go to the previous dungeon. It's actually quite useful for getting around quickly, and mostly removes the tedium of manually backtracking. I quickly stopped by Dungeon 6, which is way easier to find than Dungeon 5 for whatever reason, and quickly realized I'm outmatched by the Wizrobes. I decided I needed to look for upgrades. The first thing I did was look up what items there are, and I decided to go after the old man who has the magic sword. He's hiding beneath a grave, which I would have never found even with the hint, since touching graves summons a Poe usually. Every Poe is invincible except the one on the overworld by default, so if you kill that Poe, every other Poe on screen dies, leaving behind loot. It's a unique risk-reward system, and it almost works as a memory game. I dig it. Anyways, the old man wants us to have 12 hearts before we can take the magic sword. The game, of course, doesn't tell you this. I went off and found every heart container in the overworld and the power bracelet. Most of them were hidden behind bumpable walls or burnable trees. If you're lucky, the game gives you very vague hints as to where to look for them. The power bracelet's use is to push specific rocks that unlock shortcuts in the map, which of course is very helpful. After going back and getting the magic sword, I storm back into Dungeon 6, ready for vengeance, and somehow still get wiped by the Wizrobes. The way the Wizrobes work is that standard Wizrobes will spawn in somewhere, summon clones, and then fire projectiles at you. If you defeat the original Wizrobe, then you defeat all of its clones as well. Blue Wizrobes are the actual worst. The way they work is they walk around the room, occasionally warping or standing still and attacking you. They're unpredictable, have tons of health, and deal tons of damage all at once, especially if they corner you. What's even better is that they're usually paired with likes that you can easily be knocked into, and these enemies called bubbles. They don't deal damage, but they curse you and make it so you can't use your sword for a short period of time. You can use your recorder to get rid of the curse, but I didn't know this, because the game didn't tell me! This room is absolute hell, since they all gang up on you. At this point, it's just enemy spam, and the combat's become dreadful. A few rooms also have these statues that shoot bullets at you, and the game just becomes a bullet hell with terrible controls. Anyways, we eventually get to the dungeon's mini-boss, a refight with Aquamentus, who I did not have the health to deal with from the previous room. So guess who had to leave and go grind for more health and rupees for a potion? That's right, me! So we tediously make our way back and kill him, hip hip hooray. The rest of the dungeon is just full of these horrible encounters against Wizrobes and likes. It's awful. I eventually reached the end and fought Goma. Goma's actually a neat boss. You have to shoot arrows at it when it opens its eye while dodging bullets. It's a neat challenge and doesn't give you sensory overload, a first for this dungeon. I beat it and got the 6th Triforce shard, only 2 more to go. Hooray. This dungeon was easily the worst by far. It took me way over an hour. It was completely miserable. Oh wait, I forgot to get the dungeon item. Dungeon 6 item is the magical rod, and if combat was on its deathbed, this is what officially kills it. The magical rod is a projectile shooter that deals the same amount of damage as the white sword. It quickly goes across the entire screen and costs nothing to use, meaning you can spam it as much as you'd like. So no longer is combat about using items an enemy is weak to and carefully positioning, because you can basically just kill everything in 1 or 2 hits with the magic rod. There are 0 consequences to doing this, but fear not, they made sure to make Wizrobes immune to the magic rod. Thank God they didn't make that blunder. Anyways, I looked up a guide for the next dungeon, and it told me to bring bait, which you can get from a shop. That's kind of odd. The way you enter Dungeon 7 is by draining this empty fairy lake with your recorder. The hint you're given to do this is too vague to be helpful, but it works as great foreshadowing for the rest of the dungeon. The dungeon starts off fairly normal, except instead of frustratingly hard, it's piss easy since they use early game enemies. I explored and cleared every available room, but found nothing. Feeling defeated, I looked up a map, and almost the entire dungeon consisted of bombable walls. So I gave up and used a map for the whole dungeon. Dungeon 7 is long, cryptic, easy, and dreadfully boring, featuring only weak enemies and the same few repeated dungeon bosses as mini-bosses. Literally, some of these reused fights show up multiple times. One of the rooms has an enemy that stands still and says, "Grumble, grumble." What you're supposed to do is somehow put together that you're supposed to use the bait that I knew to grab from the shop because of the guide. How is the average person playing back in 1986 supposed to know this? Good question! At one point there's a room that asks you to find and push a random block to reveal a secret passage, forcing you to check every one until you find it. The dungeon's item is the red flame, and all it does is light up dark rooms, which the next dungeon will make this item completely worthless. What an awesome reward! This dungeon's boss is Aquamentus again, and it dies in 3 hits to magic, because of course it does. This entire dungeon was absolutely horrible and dreadfully boring and just had garbage design. It was almost my least favorite, but Dungeon 6 managed to squeak out the last place victory this time. Here's a fun fact for you guys. Because you use the recorder to warp between dungeons, but also use the recorder to drain the pond, you have to leave that screen to keep warping. Very convenient and fun. Dungeon 8 is hidden beneath this tree, blocking this path, which, to be honest, this was pretty obvious and I'm kinda dumb for never burning it. Pretty early on, after this horrendous enemy spam room, we get the Book of Magic, which adds a fire effect to the magical rod. This is actually a downgrade as it slows down your fire rate, lags the game, and get this, the fire you shoot can hurt you if you run into it. On the other hand, it does deal lots of damage to enemies stuck in the fire, but it's not really worth the trade-off in my opinion. We also get the Lion Key, which opens every locked door, making my keys I had already collected from previous dungeons completely useless. Honestly, anything to make this game go quicker is welcome. Most of the dungeon consists of rooms filled with dark nuts and statues that launch bullets, my favorite combo. Other than that, it's pretty much the same stuff from every other dungeon. It's honestly quite small, and the game has become super repetitive, so it's not really that fun. Plus, the game's fully dedicated to forcing you to bomb every wall because mandatory rooms are hidden behind them, so you're basically forced to use a map. Even the boss is just Gleeok again with more health. The only thing of note is that I accidentally burned a bush and discovered a shop that sells hearts for 10 rupees. Where has this been the whole game? It would have been super useful. Why is it hidden beneath a random bush? After that, I finally decided to go back and collect every hidden bomb upgrade. They're hidden in dungeons 5 and 7 and are behind bombable walls. Are you fucking with me? Honestly, they took barely any time to get. Now I have every last collectible and I'm prepared for the final dungeon. This is another dungeon you're essentially forced to use a map for, since it's the largest dungeon with tons of bombable walls and plenty of staircases that bring you across the entire dungeon. The boss is literally in an unmarked room. That's what we're dealing with here. Dungeon 9 is hidden behind a bombable entrance at Spectacle Rock, which I gotta say is super underwhelming. I was really expecting like a grand fortress to serve as the entrance, not some ordinary cave. This dungeon actually does something really convenient that none of the other dungeons do, and that's being near a potion shop. As long as you have the rupees, you can easily refill your health and get a potion for later, which is super convenient. Inside this dungeon, we're met with everyone's favorite enemies, Wizrobes and Like-Likes. Thank God they're back, because I was starting to miss dying in a few hits and having to restart everything. The only positive thing I could think of is that at least there's no Dark Nuts. Inside Dungeon 9 is 2 items, the red ring, which gives you more defense, and the silver arrow, which is only used to kill Ganon once. Neither of these items proved very useful since you still take a metric shit ton of damage and get cornered pretty easily, and the light arrows are only for one specific thing. I'm pretty sure they don't even deal more damage. This dungeon has 2 mini-bosses, the Landmola, who dies in 5 seconds to the magic rod, and the Patra. The way the Patra works is it uses smaller minions as a shield, and you have to kill them all before you can actually attack the leader. It's a tough fight, and I like how when it spins its heads around, they almost look 3D sometimes. Unfortunately, both of these mini-bosses show up like 3 times each and barely serve as interesting bosses. Eventually, I explored all of the dungeon. I don't know why this room didn't fill out on my map because I'm pretty sure I went into it. I readied myself for the final Ganon fight. When I went inside, Link held up the Triforce to show Ganon how epic he is, before Ganon turns invisible and starts launching bullets at you like a fucking pussy. I tried to attack Ganon, but I couldn't find him. No matter what items I used, where I stood, or what I did, nothing worked. I couldn't reveal him or even hurt him. I gave up and looked up what you're supposed to do. Apparently, all you do is stand in the corner, spam your sword until he runs into it 4 times, and then kill him in 1 hit with a light arrow. A very fitting, extremely underwhelming and cryptic boss to finish off this game. I go in and Zelda threatens me with Master Quest, which made me leap out of my chair in fright. Then the credits roll as a more jazzy version of the theme you hear when you die plays. Zelda 1 starts off as a pretty good game and slowly gets worse and worse as you keep playing. The overworld activities are cryptic and overly punishing, the dungeons are a pretty poor mix, and overall I had a mixed experience at best. I do think the challenge is very refreshing and welcome when it's fair, and the combat at its peak is very fun. Plus, it's a very satisfying game to get upgrades in, as you unlock many new abilities in both world progression and combat, so to say there's a lot of highs would be accurate. There were lots of moments I was having fun. Would I ever recommend trying this game? Definitely, at least play through the first half. Things only really go downhill as soon as you're done with Dungeon 4. That's when the game becomes poorly designed, overly cryptic, and dreadfully unbalanced. I give Zelda 1 a 4 out of 10. I really did enjoy lots of moments this game had, but the latter half of the game is indefensible. I honestly think this game deserves a true modern remake that fixes its many issues because there really is a good game in here somewhere.